Both my brother and I were puzzled by the attraction. We didn't see what she was seeing.
There was a lot of back and forth with accusations and jealousy and things of that nature.
She was interested in pursuing modeling and a career in show business.
She was posed in a very sexually demeaning way.
The news was surreal. You couldn't wrap your mind around it.
We knew he had lied to investigators about his whereabouts that weekend.
None of your business.
And that he was armed and dangerous.
I mean, after all, she was only 18 years old.
It's a crisp, cool evening in California's southern San Joaquin Valley when a frantic call comes in to police.
I'd been a patrol officer for just over a year. And I was dispatched with another officer to go to an apartment complex in southwest Bakersfield. There was a female resident that hadn't been seen for a few days. So, based on a phone call from a boyfriend, myself and another officer met the manager out front of the apartment, number 46. We went inside and walked through a living room, down a hallway, into a bedroom, and then we proceeded to the bathroom.
In the bathtub is the body of a woman. It quickly becomes obvious this is no death by natural causes.
She was face up. Her hands were bound behind her back with a piece of a telephone cord. She also had a brown pillowcase over her head and also had a piece of telephone cord wrapped around her neck.
The apartment manager tells Rourke that 18-year-old Dawn Coons lived in apartment 46.
My sister was Dawn Ellen Coons. I'm the oldest sibling. Then comes my sister Dawn, and then my younger brother Leland. Dawn was only 11 months younger. We were good companions, and we played games and imagined and enjoyed a very close-knit family life. We lived in the Bronx until I was in the second grade, and then we moved to Yonkers. We each had a bike, and we always enjoyed bike riding. We would go to the museum or to concerts. My parents were big into exposing us to culture and broadening our horizons, as it were. Dawn and I ended up going to the same high school in Yonkers, and Dawn was very popular and very well liked. She did well in school, but ultimately became bored, kind of longed for bigger and better things, bigger and better opportunities. During that time, she was interested in pursuing modeling, maybe even a career in show business. My sister was gregarious, beautiful, charming, articulate, and she had no shortage of attention. She would go to fashionable places. She got the attention of successful men, professional men, men in entertainment.
Despite her many suitors, Dawn remains in an on-again, off-again relationship with a blue-collar young man she met in high school, Steve Sherrill.
Both my brother and I were puzzled by the attraction. We didn't see what she was seeing. My mother was a nurse. She was a good judge of character, and she wasn't impressed by him because he didn't have any real sign that there was any great character or drive or ambition.
By the end of 1978, Dawn had made a decision.
I was away at college. I called home one Sunday, and she told me that she was going to Bakersfield, California with Stephen. I instantly didn't think it was a great idea.
Within months, David's fears are confirmed.
When she got out there, he found somebody else and moved on. He left her in the lurch. I don't understand why she didn't turn around and get on a plane and forget it and just come back to the city and pick up where she left off.
As officers entered the apartment, it didn't look like there were a lot of signs of struggle or any disarray in a lot of the apartment, but in that bedroom, it looked like there had been a struggle.
Some of the sheets were pulled up, the blanket was pulled back, there was a pillow on the floor, and the phone cord had been removed from the wall. The phone was sitting on the ground next to the bed.
They didn't find anything that showed forcible entry. So the belief was maybe it was an acquaintance of hers, maybe it was a crime of passion.
There wasn't much to go on. They took some hair samples. They found some fingerprints on a window, and they also found a white stain on the sheets of the bed, which they suspected was semen. You have to remember that in 1979, DNA evidence did not exist, so the police did not have the database that they do now to try to identify suspects.
With the investigation now creeping into the early morning hours, detectives reach out to Dawn's family.
My father was home. My mother was working, so she wasn't home when the police came to the door to let us know that my sister was dead. I remember my mother coming home. My father gave her the news, and I just remember her sobbing. I mean, she was just wrecked. She was just destroyed. The news was surreal. Couldn't wrap your mind around it. I just found it hard to, live my daily, day-to-day life.
Bakersfield police start interviewing Dawn's friends and associates.
They had to start pulling on threads and talking to folks and figuring out exactly why those things would or would not be important.
One of those threads is focusing on a note discovered on Dawn's door by the apartment manager.
Dawn, give me a call and let me know what you're up to. I can't seem to track you down. You're never home. Diane.
The investigators found that Dawn and Diane were pretty good friends. They worked together at Breakers and learned that Diane had been the last person to see Dawn before the weekend. Diane was a good source of information for investigators to figure out kind of some context to what was going on in Dawn's life at the time.
Investigators learned that she was last seen alive on Friday evening, January 12th, when her friend Diane dropped her off at her apartment. Diane watched her unlock the door, wave goodbye, and step inside. That was the last time she was seen alive. The next day, Diane tried to get a hold of Dawn, and she could not contact her. They had plans that day, and Dawn never showed up. Dawn did not arrive at work that evening on Saturday.
Police also interview a new man in Dawn's life.
Dawn came to California with Steve. He was the boyfriend. They subsequently broke up their relationship, and Dawn started dating a new man named Brian. And Brian was the one who called the manager to check on Dawn after he hadn't been able to contact her for a few days.
Brian was a gentleman that Dawn met at a party about 2 weeks prior to her murder. He was a nice-looking man. He had a job at a local refinery.
They talked to him, tried to find out if there was any sort of hostility between he and Dawn at the time, where he was during the weekend Dawn was killed.
He explained that he was at the refinery during the time period of this murder.
During interviews, Dawn's ex-boyfriend, Steve, is mentioned repeatedly.
Investigators found that they did not have a great relationship. They argued quite a bit, didn't get along frequently. There had been some fighting.
They also learn that Steve was at Dawn's apartment on January 12th when Diane picked her up for work.
At that point, there were some suspicions that he may have been involved in her death. During Dawn's autopsy at the Kern County Coroner's Office, the coroner found that her cause of death was asphyxiation, and the kit that they submitted came back as positive for sexual assault.
The best estimate the coroner could give for Dawn's time of death was early morning hours of Saturday the 13th. She was posed in a very sexually demeaning way. By placing the pillowcase over Dawn's face and taking away who she was, really indicated a lot about what the killer thought of her.
Less than 24 hours after finding Dawn lifeless in her apartment bathtub, investigators bring Steve, the ex-boyfriend from Yonkers, in for questioning.
Dawn was 18, Steve was 21, and she and Steve had somewhat of a rocky relationship. There was a lot of accusations and jealousy and things of that nature. Investigators wanted to know where he was that Friday night as well as the weekend in which Dawn was murdered.
He said that he had been with friends that night. He went on to further describe the way that they broke up as he broke up with Dawn, that it was something that he had moved on from, and that he had gone camping that weekend.
Steve also tries pointing detectives in another direction.
Steve told investigators that he believed that another tenant at that apartment complex may be involved, that he had shown interest in Dawn.
As an investigator, you obviously have to look into it, but you also, on the other side, are wondering, okay, you're trying to draw attention away from yourself and put it on somebody else.
So based on the information that Steve provided, the man in apartment 50, Prentice Foreman, investigators contacted Dawn's friends, even employees of the apartment complex, to determine whether or not Mr. Foreman was giving Dawn any sort of trouble or harassing her in any way. And based on those conversations with multiple people, no one other than Steve had that information or could connect Mr. Foreman to Dawn in any way.
Detectives turn back to their most promising suspect.
My mother was in contact with the police. There were some initial questions. They asked about her relationship with Steve. My mother knew that Steve was a suspect. My mother really wasn't a fan of Steve's. She blamed him for taking Dawn to California. Their relationship was still as volatile as when they were in high school. He ultimately found a new relationship and he started seeing someone. He had moved out.
They're going to try to check out and confirm an alibi. And Steve was at a party Friday night into the early morning hours of about 2 or 3 a.m. That was verified by multiple people. And then he was also out of town starting Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Again, that alibi was verified by multiple people.
Dawn's friends and family gather for her funeral. Meanwhile, police are no closer to catching her killer.
I remember hoping until the day I walked in the funeral home that somehow this was some kind of a mistake, that it wasn't her. One of the arrangements they made is that they decided that my sister was going to have an open casket. I remember seeing her, the dress she looked gorgeous in. You could see what had happened. You know, there was some discoloration. But she was beautiful just the same way as she always was. There were a lot of relatives and friends that came. There was a service from the organization she belonged to, the Triangle Girls, a Masonic organization that is for young women. They actually have this very beautiful ceremony they do where they read these poems and there's flowers involved.
News of Dawn's murder makes headlines, both in California and her hometown of Yonkers.
I was a reporter at the Yonkers Herald-Statesman in Yonkers, New York. I spent a decade as a crime reporter, and I covered my share of stories. And after all these years, interestingly enough and inexplicably, the only name of a victim I can remember is Dawn Ellen Coons. I think one reason might be is because people I spoke to her, they thought she was an exciting, dynamic young woman. They thought that she would really make something of herself. And I sort of became cast under her spell a little bit by virtue of learning so much about her and learning what a delightful person she was. I felt that it was a worthy story for our readers. Our readers would want to know about it because it's a local girl, even though it happened on the West Coast, 3,000 miles away.
Even though his alibi checks out, police aren't ready to eliminate Dawn's ex-boyfriend, Steve.
Well, obviously, the primary suspect would be current boyfriend or previous boyfriend. And based on the information they had obtained from family, associates, and friends about this rocky relationship between Dawn and Steve, they were still primarily focused on Steve.
Some of the challenges that investigators faced initially was that Dawn and Steve were both from New York, so they had to do somewhat of a long-distance investigation using the local police departments over there to help facilitate some of the interviews.
The police left no stone unturned. They were very thorough.
There was no signs of forced entry in the door. Nothing was taken from the apartment. It's very plausible that she knew who did this to her. So without other information or leads, investigators are stuck looking at their primary suspect, and in this case was still Steve. Steve agreed to participate in a polygraph examination, and eventually he did exactly that.
Detectives wait to see if Dawn's ex-boyfriend, Steve, will pass the polygraph.
Polygraphs are used by investigators frequently as sort of a tool to get them better leads. They're certainly not admissible in court, but they are an investigative tool that can be helpful given the situation and the investigation.
A polygraph examiner from San Francisco, he comes to Bakersfield to conduct the polygraph examination with Stephen. During the polygraph examination, he asks him 4 questions. Did you cause Dawn Coons' death? Were you in the apartment when she died? Do you know how Dawn was killed? And the 4th question, do you know who killed Dawn? And Steve answered no to each of these questions. The polygraph examiner determined that Stephen was telling the truth.
Despite the fact that he passed the polygraph test, Steve remains a person of interest to detectives.
People can lie in a polygraph examination, but still indicate by the examiner that maybe he believes they're telling the truth.
Polygraphs have always been something that's kind of a sticking point when it comes to investigations, especially in California. And ultimately, it is not something that investigators can really rest a case on.
Once again, the investigation turns to looking for answers in New York.
Investigators were obviously hoping that this could provide them with a lead.
Sometimes you find that police are a little reluctant to talk to you for whatever reason, but the folks out there in Bakersfield were very approachable. I think the reason was because they were frustrated by lack of leads, and they were looking for any help they could get. Maybe someone knew something out here on the East Coast that they didn't bump into in Bakersfield.
Investigators come up empty on the East Coast. So without much else to go on, they focus on the neighbors Steve found so suspicious.
Prentice Foreman was a truck driver, and was living in Bakersfield.
They talked to Mr. Foreman about where he was the weekend of Dawn's death, and Mr. Foreman claimed he was with his girlfriend, LaTanya, the entire weekend, that he did not know Dawn in any way other than maybe a neighborly hello once in a while at the mailboxes.
Prentice was very cooperative with investigators, answered all their questions.
As investigators cross names of people that knew Dawn off their list, they are forced to consider another grim possibility.
It's not uncommon for victims to know their killers. And as a result, the police are usually able to find some connection that implicates the killer. In the case of serial killers or drifters, they have no connection to the community. They're in and out, and as a result, it's difficult for the police to find any connective tissues, any clues that would point to that person.
There was another homicide that same weekend, Lynn Sue Atkins. Investigators didn't know if these two homicides were related or if both of them knew each other or anything like that.
Investigators reached out to the California Department of Justice to determine if there was possibly a serial killer. They received information about 4 homicides that occurred, 2 in 1978 and 2 in 1979. These homicides involved white females. And these victims of homicide, all in the LA area, they had been tied up and died of a form of asphyxiation, just like Dawn.
Despite the similarities, investigators can't connect Dawn's murder to these other killings. By the end of 1979, leads in the case have evaporated like morning dew in the hot California sun, and the case goes cold.
My mother did most of the communication with the detectives. Once it went beyond a year and there was really no word, my mother's phone calls were less frequent. There were no new suspects, there were no new leads. It just sort of languished. This whole situation had a negative impact on my parents' marriage. My mother was very distant from my father. I think Dawn's murder was the thing that ended their relationship. 5 years passed, 10 years passed. My father, he died 2001. My mother, she hoped that they would catch who'd murdered her daughter, but I don't really think she had anything to hope for at that point. I got to the point personally where I thought, is it ever going to be solved?
Then, 32 years after Dawn's murder, David gets the call he thought would never come.
They contacted me and they said, we are going to resume the investigation. Then things started happening. My sister always had a very special bond with my younger brother. She doted on him. You know, it was just a very special bond she had. My brother, Leland, contacted a friend in law enforcement, and he contacted the Bakersfield police to resume the investigation.
The case itself really wasn't getting any attention up until the family called.
So when investigators reopened the case in 2011, one of the first things they did was pull from their archives the police reports and tried to determine if there was any physical evidence that could be now used with recent DNA technology to try to solve the case. In their diligence, they learned that there was a rape kit taken at Dawn's autopsy in 1979, and that had been preserved and properly kept within the chain of custody. Investigators sent a large amount of evidence to the crime lab for possible DNA testing. The pillowcase, the cords from Dawn's wrists, the cord from around her neck, as well as remnants of her fingernail clippings that had been taken at her autopsy.
And then also the rape kit that had been seized as evidence as part of the autopsy. Unfortunately, what they learned was that we did not have a quality sample that had stood up through all of that time that gave us a sufficient quantity of testable substance.
The quantity of that sample was too low to upload into the CODIS database to yield results. It essentially was too degraded on all fronts to give any sort of real lead.
So investigators still believed that Steve was the main suspect in this. However, the decision was made just to wait because we knew that technology was evolving.
2 years later, investigators are given new hope by a random discovery.
In 2015, during a routine office cleanout, the Kern County Coroner's Office discovered some evidence related to many cases that had been in a storage facility that no one really knew about. And inside one of those boxes was a sample from Dawn's rape kit, 2 slides, which had been marked with Dawn's case number.
When the slides are brought to the crime lab for analysis, Bakersfield police are told they will finally have what they've been waiting for. After 36 years, there is enough sample to create a DNA profile of Dawn's killer for comparison.
This is either going to corroborate the suspect that we've been looking at all these years, or it's going to lead us into a completely different direction.
At the top of the list for the investigators when it comes to sample comparisons was Steve.
I guess things didn't go well for Steve. After Dawn was murdered, he returned to Yonkers. His family lives there.
Steve ultimately leaves New York and settles in Florida.
Investigators obtained a warrant for Steve's DNA and then flew to Florida to collect a sample for comparison.
During the interview with Steve, he was cooperative, and in his mind, he believed that he had been cleared. I don't think he realized that he was still the primary suspect in this investigation.
I had enough faith in the system to put myself totally in your guys' hands that you could find out what happened, you know?
Steve spoke with investigators and sort of detailed the nature of his relationship with Dawn.
He was cooperative in the sense that he voluntarily provided a sample.
Investigators take the sample back to California for analysis. Months later, investigators get the results.
Investigators compare the DNA evidence that we have on file with the DNA sample that was obtained from Steve, and it's not a match. The investigation, in all honesty, stalls.
Now that they had their main suspect cleared, investigators had to link that full profile into the CODIS system to see if there were any matches in that system.
There was a new kit that was coming out in 2017 that was essentially more sensitive and could detect more degraded samples.
Investigators submit the profile to CODIS, but the line behind newer cases is long. While authorities wait for results, the Coons family suffers another loss when Dawn's mother passes away.
What I find heartbreaking is that as the years went on and no word, no new developments, I think that my mother probably felt that it was something that would never be solved.
To somewhat bring some closure to the family when they've been searching for answers for so long is why I do my job. It's why I became a prosecutor, and it's why I continue to be a prosecutor.
The procedure for submitting DNA into CODIS isn't a fast one. It's one that takes a lot of approvals, and ultimately, it takes quite a while to get that comparison back.
After months of waiting, results of the CODIS search finally come back.
There was a CODIS hit.
Initially, when we got this information, everybody was very excited because we had something, we had a direction to go in this case. There was a little bit of surprise.
It was the man who lived in apartment 50, Prentice Foreman.
I was working in the cold case homicide unit when I received notification and basically said, you got a positive hit that identified a potential suspect.
A national database match leads Detective Kerner to a man named Prentice Foreman.
Prentice Foreman was interviewed by the detectives in 1979. And during that interview, he basically told the detectives that he had seen her in passing, would wave at her, maybe say hello to her, and he gave an alibi. He said he was with his girlfriend at the time. I saw that his alibi, LaTanya, had never been interviewed, so we didn't have any information about what she had to say about this.
One of the main things we wanted to do was verify whether or not he was with LaTanya during the weekend that Dawn was murdered.
She was actually at the residence that was listed on her college transcripts from 1979. So I actually met with LaTanya at her residence, and she admitted to being a friend of Prentice. I gave her the time frame of the murder, January 12th, 1979, and she told me that she was not with Prentice during that time, that she was actually in Texas attending college. I needed to corroborate that. So I reached out, and the administrator, fortunately, did some research and located some transcripts from that time period for LaTanya that she was in Texas attending college at the time of this murder.
We knew that his original statement was going to be a big piece of evidence for us because we could now prove he was in fact lying. It was very important for us to try to get a statement from Foreman, a recent statement. So Detective Kerner was able to locate a valid phone number for Prentice Foreman, and he called him.
The question now came down to, what is he going to say?
One day after speaking with LaTanya, Detective Kerner calls the man that investigators first spoke with nearly 39 years earlier.
Well, who am I speaking with, sir?
My name is Prentice Foreman.
I've got some photos of a guy that we've been looking at for a long time, and I'm hoping I'd like to meet with you to show you these photos.
I spoke with a detective years ago. I didn't know nothing then. I don't know nothing now.
But I never really identified or told him what case I was referring to. I didn't really have that opportunity to get that deep into the conversation. But I knew that I had to keep him on the phone.
Did you guys have any type of intimate relationship or not, Mr. Foreman? That's all I want to know.
None of your business.
When we heard his tone and tenor on the phone, as well as his total lack of cooperation, we sort of knew that this was going to become important as to what he had to say now. We knew that we had a lot of pieces of the puzzle already. We had from Steve, Dawn was afraid of the man who lived in apartment 50. We knew that was Prentice Foreman. We knew he had lied to investigators about his whereabouts that weekend. And then we also had a very strong DNA sample from her rape kit. The decision was made at that time to issue the arrest warrant and bring him in for a formal interview. Foreman was arrested in Bakersfield, an apartment he was living at. He was brought in downtown to the Bakersfield Police Department station, and he was given his Miranda rights. He decided to waive those rights and indicated a willingness to speak to investigators.
When Prentice Foreman first came into the interview room, he was almost challenging. Anything you say may be used against you in court. You understand that?
Didn't I tell that to you already?
I started asking him questions about his relationship with Dawn.
Now, you remember me from talking on the telephone, correct?
Naturally.
Okay. What kind of a relationship did you and Miss Coons have?
Friends.
Okay. When you say friends, I mean, explain that to me. What do you mean friends?
One sexual encounter.
I now had to establish a time frame.
When did that sexual encounter take place?
That's eventually what I did.
Months before that.
Months before that?
Yes.
Okay.
Months.
So from the time
Yes.
that was your sexual encounter months before?
Months back.
October?
3 months before then.
As soon as he said that, my partner and I basically kind of look at each other, and we knew right then and there he was done. We knew as investigators that the sperm is going to die within a few days. And obviously, if Prentice Foreman is saying that he had sex with her 4 months earlier, obviously his DNA wouldn't be there any longer.
Within 48 hours of his arrest, Mr. Foreman was arraigned on a single count of first-degree murder.
It was a relief. I put many hours into this case, and the biggest relief for me was closure for the family.
The call from Bakersfield Police stuns David.
After 4 decades, I couldn't believe it. They had someone, maybe it was on its way to being solved. But of course, you had to go through a trial first.
One of the first things that I did was looking through the report to make sure we could actually prove what happened to a jury some 40 years later. What evidence is there still that has maintained its integrity and we can actually use for a jury at a trial? This was first-degree, premeditated, willful, deliberate murder that someone did. They just had to decide, was it Prentice Foreman?
I was only 5 years old when this homicide occurred, but here I am, 40 years later, the lead investigator, and I was able to maybe bring some closure to the family and some justice.
Nearly 4 decades after Dawn Coons' murder, Bakersfield police arrest Prentice Foreman for the crime. When Foreman pleads not guilty, prosecutors now face the challenge of bringing a 40-year-old case to life for a jury.
That's always a concern, especially on a 40-year-old case, is the longer it goes, the longer it's drawn out, the harder our case is going to be to prove to 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt. The report had been maintained, the original report from 1979, as well as the original rape kit and the slides. All the photos from 1979 and the autopsy had also been properly preserved.
17 months after Foreman's arrest, Gina Pearl finally takes the case to a jury.
The defense was claiming a consensual relationship with Dawn.
The fact that 2 individuals have sex and one of them dies afterwards, we don't know how long afterwards, doesn't tell us that that sex partner killed the other.
Defense did try to make a point in that Diane was her closest friend and coworker. If really the man in apartment 50 was so harassing and so horrible, Dawn would have mentioned that to her. And so obviously the defense was going to try to throw out as many suspects as they could possibly find. We were able to successfully argue against their attempts to point the finger at someone else. This defendant is the man in apartment 50. Dawn and Mr. Foreman knew each other in the sense that Dawn had seen him around the apartment complex before. She had expressed fear to Steve about the man who lived in apartment 50. He is the one who was harassing Dawn, giving her a hard time in the weeks leading up to her murder. She did have a habit of keeping her front door unlocked, and that's how I believe Mr. Foreman was able to get in. I believe Mr. Foreman entered the apartment and Dawn was already in her bedroom, either asleep or going to sleep. The attack definitely happened in the bedroom. The sheets were thrown about, the mattress was exposed, the lamp was knocked over, and the telephone cords were cut, all indicating that that is where the sexual assault and ultimately the murder happened. I believe Mr. Foreman went in prepared and planning to have sex with Dawn, whether or not she consented. When she saw him and said no, that's when he became violent and put the pillowcase over her, cut the cords, bound her wrists, and was able to overcome her.
After nearly 2 days of deliberation, the jury comes back with a verdict. Prentice Foreman is found guilty in one of Kern County's oldest unsolved homicides, the murder of Dawn Coons.
When they did read the verdict, I looked at Prentice, and he was obviously, I guess you could say, stunned and in disbelief. I honestly don't know if he really understood what just happened. It was almost like he was dazed.
On July 10th, 2019, a judge sentences Foreman to 25 years to life in prison.
Unfortunately, Dawn Coons' mother was no longer with us, but Dawn's brothers were, and I felt great that they could finally have some closure.
I had contact with David Coons throughout, and he gave me a beautifully written letter as well as a bouquet of yellow roses, which were Dawn's favorite. Those flowers and that note are prominently displayed in my office.
I was so happy to meet her because what she did for my family, the way she tried the case, I think that she gave everything she could, as if Dawn was her own sister or her daughter. But the fact that the man has been tried and convicted, to me, is immaterial. I'm still missing something. Dawn was definitely unique and special. I'm still grief-stricken that my sister was taken from me, that I've been denied the opportunity to see her develop, to succeed, to see what her life would have become. Those things are still missing for me.
At 1:42 a.m., when most of California was asleep and the streets were reduced to humming sodium lights and the low static of night air, a single patrol car rolled slowly past a modest house that had no idea it was already part of history. Nothing looked wrong. No broken windows. No raised voices. No movement behind the curtains. Just a quiet residential block, the kind built on routine and trust, the kind where crimes are supposed to happen somewhere else. And yet, inside that stillness, something irreversible had already taken place. Something that would not be named for decades. Something that would become a cold case before anyone realized how cold it would grow. In 1987, the neighborhood was ordinary in the most dangerous way possible. People waved without knowing names. Doors were locked more out of habit than fear. Nights passed uneventfully, blurring into mornings filled with commutes, coffee, and small talk. The woman who lived in that house fit perfectly into that rhythm. Known, predictable, present, until suddenly she wasn't. Until absence became the loudest sound on the street. The discovery came not with a scream, but with confusion. A door unlocked when it shouldn't have been. A bed untouched. A car still in the driveway, keys missing, purse left behind. The house felt paused, as if its occupant had stepped out briefly and forgotten to return. Police were called not in panic, but in disbelief, the kind that resists acknowledging danger until it has no other choice. Officers entered carefully, announcing themselves into rooms that answered with silence. They documented the scene with the tools and instincts of the time, unaware that they were standing at the beginning of a mystery that would outlast careers, technologies, even assumptions about justice itself. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious struggle, nothing broken, nothing stolen. The normality was unsettling, a surface too smooth to trust. Neighbors gathered as word spread. Faces tight with concern, voices low, eyes scanning the street for anything that might suddenly explain everything. Someone mentioned a car seen late. Another recalled footsteps. Another thought they heard laughter, or maybe an argument, or maybe just the television from next door. Memory became fluid the moment suspicion entered the air. Everyone wanted to help. No one had certainty. By sunrise, police tape cut through the block like a wound. Reporters arrived. Questions multiplied. The phrase "missing under suspicious circumstances" appeared in early bulletins, cautious and inadequate. Detectives began canvassing, collecting statements, reconstructing timelines that never quite aligned. Friends were questioned. Co-workers interviewed. A former romantic connection briefly drew attention, then faded under scrutiny. Leads appeared, then evaporated. Evidence was collected, logged, stored. Fibers, hairs, biological traces so small they barely registered as significant at the time. In 1987, forensic science was advancing, but it was still blunt, still limited, still learning how to listen to what evidence wanted to say. The investigators believed answers would come quickly because answers usually did. They did not yet understand that this case would resist resolution with a quiet, stubborn persistence. Days turned into weeks. Search efforts expanded, then contracted. Helicopters traced grids that yielded nothing. Remote areas were checked and rechecked. Each negative result deepened the sense of wrongness, the feeling that the truth was close but unreachable, hiding just beyond perception. The case refused to escalate into something obvious. It stayed eerily contained, as if the crime itself had been careful not to draw attention. The community felt the shift immediately. Porch lights stayed on all night. Conversations lowered in volume. Parents walked children to bus stops they had once watched from windows. The house became an object of fixation not because it looked different but because it didn't. It stood there unchanged, holding on to its secrets with unsettling composure. As months passed, momentum slowed. Tips decreased. Witnesses moved away. Memories blurred. Detectives rotated assignments. Fresh eyes brought fresh theories but no breakthroughs. The case file thickened with reports that led nowhere, with interviews that ended in shrugs, with diagrams that suggested paths the evidence refused to follow. Eventually, the phrase "cold case" entered the conversation, first quietly, then officially. It was spoken with reluctance, as if naming it might make it permanent. Cold case meant unresolved. It meant waiting. It meant admitting that the investigation had reached the limits of what it could do at that time. The file was shelved, not forgotten, but stored with the hope that someday, somehow something would change. Years passed. The world moved forward. Technology advanced. The neighborhood aged. New families moved in, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The house changed hands. Paint colors shifted. Landscaping was redone. On the surface, life continued uninterrupted. But beneath it all, the unanswered questions lingered, quiet but persistent. For the family, time did not move forward so much as stretch. Hope flared with every rumor, every supposed sighting, every anonymous call. Then it dimmed again. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. The absence became permanent, a presence in its own right, shaping decisions, conversations, futures. Inside law enforcement, the case became a reference point, mentioned occasionally in training or late-night conversations, a reminder of the ones that got away, not because of neglect but because of limitation. Evidence remained boxed and labeled, preserved as best as possible, waiting for a future that no one could define. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, that future arrived. DNA analysis changed. What once required large, pristine samples could now work with fragments, with degradation, with time. Cold cases across the country began to stir, reopened not with urgency, but with curiosity. What if the answers had been there all along? The file was pulled again. Old evidence re-examined. Samples retested. The process was methodical, cautious, stripped of optimism. Detectives had learned not to expect miracles. They worked quietly, aware that hope once awakened can be dangerous. And then one night the data aligned. A profile emerged. Not a theory. Not a hunch. A match. Statistically overwhelming. Undeniable. The past, silent for decades, finally spoke. The name belonged to someone unremarkable. Someone who had lived nearby. Someone who had never raised alarms. Someone who had moved through life without attracting attention, blending into the background of a community that had learned to stop looking. There were no previous arrests tied to the crime. No confessions. Just a life that had continued uninterrupted while the case slept. Detectives moved quickly. Warrants were prepared. Surveillance began. The hours stretched with tension as officers prepared to confront a truth that had waited 36 years to surface. It was late when they knocked. Late enough for the moment to feel suspended in time. The arrest was quiet. No resistance. No spectacle. Just handcuffs closing under porch-light glow. The weight of decades settling into a single moment. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, sensing history even if they didn't yet understand it. By morning, headlines would declare the impossible. California 1987 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough. Late-night arrest. But in that first quiet hour, before the cameras, before the commentary, there was only the realization that the night of disappearance had never truly ended. It had been waiting, patient, preserved, and now finally it had returned to demand an explanation. The arrest did not bring relief the way people expect it to, not immediately, not cleanly, because when a cold case wakes up after decades, it does not rise gently. It lurches forward, dragging the weight of every unanswered question with it, forcing the present to absorb the past all at once. As dawn broke over the neighborhood, the street filled with a nervous energy that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely overdue, as if the ground itself had been holding its breath since 1987 and had only now decided to exhale. Inside the interrogation room, the air was heavy with time. The suspects sat under fluorescent lights that hummed faintly, hands folded, posture composed, face offering nothing to read easily. Decades had passed since the night investigators were now circling. Decades during which memory had aged, softened at the edges, learned how to hide. Detectives began carefully, grounding their questions in routine, in biography, in the unremarkable details of a life lived quietly in parallel with an unresolved crime. Where were you living in the late 80s? What did your days look like? Who did you know on that street? Each answer landed with practiced calm, but the room did not forget why it existed. The DNA evidence loomed invisibly between them. A silent witness immune to hesitation, immune to revision. Science had done what time could not. It had reached backward and pointed, transforming what had once been possibility into accusation. The detectives knew better than to rush. They understood that truth, when cornered, often waits for silence before revealing itself. Outside that room, the case unfolded again in real time. Investigators reopened files that had not been touched in years, re-examining notes written by hands long since retired, tracing decisions made under different rules, different technologies, different assumptions. What had once been considered insignificant now demanded scrutiny. Timelines were reconstructed. Old interviews replayed. Statements reread with fresh eyes sharpened by knowledge that had not existed before. The neighborhood responded unevenly. Some residents watched the news in stunned quiet, recognizing street names, landmarks, fragments of their own lives suddenly framed by flashing graphics and urgent tones. Others refused to engage, turning away from screens as if attention itself might reopen wounds they had learned to live beside. The realization settled slowly but firmly. The danger had not come from outside. It had lived nearby, familiar, unnoticed. In 1987, investigators had knocked on doors along the block, asking routine questions, collecting routine answers. The suspect had been one of many. Cooperative, polite, forgettable. At the time, nothing about him stood out. No criminal history, no visible motive. He blended into the background noise of the street, another neighbor among neighbors. Looking back, detectives would later admit that this was precisely what made the case so difficult. The crime had not announced itself through chaos. It had hidden inside normalcy. As news spread, former residents began to call in, drawn out of silence by the shock of recognition. Memories resurfaced, tentative and fragmented, shaped by decades of distance. Someone remembered seeing him walking late at night. Someone else recalled a conversation that had once felt inconsequential, but now seemed weighted with implication. None of it was definitive. All of it mattered. The past, once dormant, was suddenly crowded with voices. The family of the victim learned of the arrest the way so many families do now, through a phone call that arrived without warning, delivering words they had imagined and feared in equal measure. We have a suspect. There is DNA. The case is moving forward. The language was careful, procedural, but its impact was seismic. Hope surged, tangled with grief, with anger, with disbelief that the wait might finally be ending. For them, the arrest did not close a chapter. It ripped one open. 36 years collapsed into a single moment, carrying with it birthdays missed, questions unanswered, futures rewritten by absence. The name of the suspect echoed differently for them, not as a revelation, but as a confrontation with time itself, with everything that had been lost while the truth remained hidden. Inside law enforcement, the mood was restrained but charged. No one declared victory. They had learned too much for that. Instead, they focused on building a case that could survive scrutiny, aware that delayed justice invites intense examination. Every piece of evidence would be challenged, every memory questioned, every decision from 1987 dissected. They worked with the understanding that solving a cold case is not just about finding the truth, but about proving it beyond doubt, long after the moment has passed. The DNA match was central, but it was not alone. Investigators sought corroboration, context, motive. They examined the suspect's movements at the time, his proximity, his access, his relationships. They compared what he said now with what he had said then, noting subtle shifts, omissions, changes that might mean nothing or everything. Time complicates truth, but it also reveals patterns that are invisible up close. As the story unfolded publicly, the headlines sharpened. California, 1987. Cold case solved. DNA breakthrough. Late-night arrest. Each phrase carried weight, but none could capture the texture of what was happening beneath the surface. This was not a neat narrative. It was a collision between eras, between outdated evidence and modern certainty, between memory and proof. In court filings, the language was clinical, stripped of emotion, but the implications were enormous. The prosecution outlined a timeline that had once been speculative and was now anchored by science. The defense prepared to challenge the reliability of decades-old evidence, to question contamination, handling, interpretation. The courtroom would become the next battleground, a place where time itself would be put on trial. Meanwhile, the neighborhood adjusted again, this time to attention rather than mystery. News vans parked along the curb. Cameras pointed at houses that had never before been noteworthy. Residents were asked how they felt, what they remembered, whether they had ever suspected anything. Many struggled to answer, caught between the desire to help and the discomfort of hindsight. Suspicion, once absent, now threatened to rewrite every memory. At night, the street grew quiet again, but it was a different quiet, charged with awareness. People looked at familiar houses differently, reconsidered the meaning of proximity, of routine, of the unexamined trust that had defined the area for so long. The arrest had not restored innocence. It had exposed how fragile innocence had always been. Inside a holding cell, the suspect waited, the future narrowing rapidly. Whatever he felt, whatever he remembered, whatever he denied, the DNA did not waver. It remained constant, a biological record that refused to forget what the human mind might try to blur. Science had reached across decades and placed a hand on his shoulder, insisting on recognition. As the case moved toward arraignment, the weight of expectation grew. For the family, for the investigators, for a community that had lived with an unanswered question for most of a lifetime. The cold case, once dormant, now dominated conversation, forcing everyone involved to confront not just what had happened, but how long it had taken to matter again. And beneath it all ran a deeper unease, a realization that time had not protected anyone, that it had merely delayed the reckoning. The night in 1987 had not faded. It had been preserved, waiting patiently for the moment when the world would finally be capable of hearing what it had left behind. As the case advanced toward its first court appearance, the passage of time became both weapon and wound, pressed into service by both sides, shaping every argument before a single word was spoken aloud. The courtroom did not yet know it, but it would soon become a place where decades collided, where the language of 1987 met the precision of modern science, and where memory itself would be treated as evidence, fragile and contested, stretched thin by years of silence. The prosecution moved deliberately, aware that the strength of their case rested not on drama but on discipline. They rebuilt the night from fragments preserved against all odds, mapping movements, revisiting geography, tracing how two lives had intersected in ways no one had recognized at the time. The narrative they prepared was not sensational. It was quiet, methodical, almost restrained, because restraint is what survives scrutiny when the defense begins to press. At the center of it all was the DNA, the biological truth that refused to age, that existed outside narrative and motive and explanation. It did not care about alibis remembered imperfectly or witnesses who could no longer testify. It simply stated that at some point, in some way, two people had been in contact, and that contact had been preserved in microscopic detail long after everything else had blurred. The prosecution knew the defense would attack its integrity, question its handling, its storage, its chain of custody, every step it took from evidence bag to laboratory bench. Investigators were called back into the past, asked to remember decisions made when they were younger, when protocols were different, when the tools available shaped what was possible. They reviewed their own handwriting, listened to recordings of interviews conducted with voices that now sounded distant, almost unfamiliar. They prepared to explain why certain avenues had been pursued and others abandoned, why some evidence had been prioritized while other pieces were logged and left untouched. There was no room for nostalgia, only accountability. The defense, meanwhile, focused on time itself as their primary argument, framing it not as a neutral passage but as a corrosive force. They spoke of degradation, of contamination, of human error accumulating invisibly over decades. They raised questions about preservation standards that would never meet today's expectations, about laboratories that no longer existed, about technicians who could not be questioned. Their strategy was clear. If the past could not be trusted, then neither could the conclusions drawn from it. Public interest surged again as these arguments entered the record. News segments broke down technical details for audiences hungry for clarity, for certainty, for a simple explanation of how something so old could suddenly become so decisive. The phrase DNA breakthrough was repeated until it risked losing meaning, even as its implications grew heavier. This was not just about one case. It was about whether time could still be outrun, whether truth could still surface after being buried for so long. The community watched closely, some from a distance, others with an intensity that bordered on obsession. People revisited their own memories, measuring them against the emerging timeline, wondering if they had missed something, if there had been signs they failed to recognize. Guilt surfaced in unexpected places, not because anyone believed they were responsible, but because hindsight has a way of assigning weight to moments that once felt insignificant. The victim's family prepared themselves for a process they had never fully believed would arrive. Courtrooms had always been abstract spaces, symbols rather than destinations. Now they became real, tangible, unavoidable. They studied schedules, learned legal terminology, familiarized themselves with procedures that would shape the next phase of their lives. The weight, which had defined them for decades, was giving way to something more demanding: participation. On the day of the arraignment, the atmosphere was thick with expectation. Cameras lined the steps outside. Reporters rehearsed phrasing, ready to compress 36 years into a handful of sentences. Inside, the room was quiet, controlled, governed by rules designed to contain emotion rather than invite it. When the defendant entered, the room shifted subtly, attention narrowing, breath held collectively for reasons no one could articulate fully. He looked older than the photographs from the 80s, inevitably so, his face shaped by time, by a life lived mostly outside suspicion. There was no visible recognition in his expression, no obvious reaction to the charges read aloud, no acknowledgement of the weight now pressing down. He stood as the words were spoken, each one anchoring him more firmly to a night he had outlived but could not escape. The charges themselves were stark, direct, unadorned by the years they represented. Murder. Related offenses. The legal language did not soften them. It stripped them of narrative, reducing them to definitions that demanded response. The plea was entered. Not guilty. The sound of it carried across the room with a finality that felt premature, almost defiant. Outside, reactions were divided. Some saw the plea as expected, procedural, a necessary step. Others felt it as an insult, an extension of the silence that had defined the case for so long. Social media filled with speculation, judgment, analysis conducted at a distance, fueled by partial information and the human need for resolution. The case had returned to the public consciousness, but now it belonged to a different era, one less patient with ambiguity. As pretrial motions accumulated, the battle lines became clearer. The defense sought to exclude evidence, to limit testimony, to frame the DNA as unreliable given its age. The prosecution responded with expert witnesses, with documentation, with a careful reconstruction of how the evidence had been preserved and why it could be trusted. Each filing added another layer to the story, another lens through which the past would be examined. Behind the scenes, detectives worked to fill gaps that time had carved into the case. They tracked down former neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances, anyone who might still remember something useful. Some memories returned reluctantly, others with surprising clarity, though clarity did not always mean accuracy. Each statement was treated cautiously, weighed against the possibility of influence, of suggestion, of reconstruction shaped by years of speculation. The suspect's history was examined with new intensity. Not just where he had been that night, but who he had been around that time, how he had moved through the neighborhood, what opportunities he might have had. Patterns were sought, not to create a narrative where none existed, but to understand whether the crime fit into a broader context or stood alone as an anomaly. The answers were inconclusive, offering possibilities rather than certainty. As the trial date approached, the emotional toll intensified. For the family, anticipation was laced with fear. The knowledge that even a conviction would not restore what had been lost, that the best possible outcome would still be incomplete. For the community, the case forced a reckoning with assumptions long held and rarely questioned, about safety, about familiarity, about how easily danger can blend into the background when it chooses to. In quiet moments, investigators reflected on the improbability of the moment. That a case so old could return with such force. That evidence preserved through shifting standards could still speak clearly. That science could reach back across decades and change the trajectory of lives in the present. It felt both miraculous and unsettling. A reminder that time does not erase accountability, it only postpones it. The night of the crime loomed larger now than it had in years, reconstructed again and again in preparation for trial. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency was magnified. The absence that had once defined the case was slowly being filled, not with certainty but with structure, with argument, with a framework that could finally be tested in open court. And as the legal machinery gathered momentum, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. The case was no longer just about what had happened in 1987. It was about whether justice could withstand delay, whether memory could survive scrutiny, whether truth could emerge intact after being submerged for so long. The courtroom would soon demand answers, and time, once an accomplice to silence, would be called as a witness, forced to account for everything it had taken and everything it had preserved. The trial opened without ceremony. No dramatic flourish to mark the moment when a story that had lived in shadows for decades finally stepped into the light. Courtrooms are not built for catharsis. They are built for order, for procedure, for the slow grinding of truth through rules designed to protect it from distortion. Still, as the first witnesses were sworn in, the room carried a charge that could not be legislated away, the sense that time itself had been summoned and was now required to testify. The prosecution began where the case had always begun, not with the arrest, not with the DNA, but with the absence. They spoke of the night when routine fractured quietly, of a home left in a state that suggested interruption rather than violence, of a woman who vanished without warning and left behind questions that refused to age. Their words were measured, deliberate, avoiding spectacle, because spectacle invites doubt. They knew the defense would be listening for excess, for emotion masquerading as fact. Jurors leaned forward as photographs appeared. Images preserved from another era, grainy and imperfect but undeniable in their stillness. The house, the rooms, the objects left behind. Each image was a frozen moment, a reminder that time does not move evenly, that some nights remain suspended while the world rushes past them. The prosecution narrated carefully, letting the evidence speak without forcing it to shout. When investigators from the original case took the stand, the years showed in their posture, in the pauses before they answered, in the way they chose words with a precision born of hindsight. They described the initial response, the early theories, the decisions made under pressure and with limited tools. They did not claim perfection. They claimed effort. They acknowledged what they did not know then and what they know now. The honesty mattered. Jurors respond to candor when time has made arrogance impossible. The defense cross-examined with focus, pressing on inconsistencies, on procedures that would never pass modern standards, on the simple truth that 1987 was not equipped to handle evidence the way the present demands. They asked about storage conditions, about labeling, about transfers between facilities. They asked whether anyone could say with absolute certainty that contamination had never occurred. The implication hung in the air. Doubt does not need to be proven, only introduced. Then the science took the stand and the atmosphere shifted. Expert witnesses spoke in the language of probability, of genetic markers, of statistical certainty so overwhelming it bordered on inevitability. They explained how DNA persists, how it resists time more effectively than memory or paper or tape. They described the methods used to extract meaning from fragments once considered useless, how advances had turned whispers into declarations. The defense countered with their own experts, voices measured and skeptical, reminding the jury that science is not infallible, that interpretation matters, that laboratories are staffed by humans capable of error. They spoke of false confidence, of the danger of treating numbers as destiny. The battle was not just about what the DNA said, but about how much authority it should be granted after decades of silence. As testimony unfolded, the timeline of the night was reconstructed piece by piece, not as a seamless narrative but as a mosaic of moments. A neighbor returning home late. A light seen on when it was usually off. A sound that could not be identified then and could not be trusted now. Each fragment was placed carefully, tested for fit, challenged, repositioned. The picture that emerged was incomplete but compelling, suggestive rather than definitive. The defendant watched quietly, his reactions minimal, his gaze often fixed on the table before him. When he was mentioned directly, there was no visible flinch, no obvious recognition. This absence of reaction became its own point of speculation, though the court resisted reading meaning into it. Silence can mean many things. The law understands this. The public rarely does. The victim's family sat through each day with a discipline born of long waiting. They did not expect relief. They expected endurance. Each witness brought them closer to answers and further into pain, reopening wounds that had never healed cleanly. They listened as strangers described moments of their loved one's life in the language of evidence, precise and impersonal. Knowing this was the price of clarity. As the trial progressed, patterns emerged not just in testimony but in perception. Jurors began to understand the shape of the case, its strengths and its vulnerabilities. They saw how time had both obscured and preserved, how it had erased some possibilities while making others undeniable. The question was no longer whether something had happened, but whether the prosecution had met the burden of proving who was responsible beyond reasonable doubt. The defense leaned heavily into uncertainty, reminding the jury again and again that doubt thrives in delay. They pointed out witnesses who could no longer be cross-examined, records that no longer existed, opportunities lost forever to the passage of years. They argued that the state was asking the jury to compensate for time's damage with trust in technology, a trade they urged caution in making. The prosecution responded by reframing time, not as an obstacle but as context. They argued that while memory fades, biology does not lie, that while procedures evolve, evidence preserved in good faith remains valid, that justice delayed is not justice denied if truth can still be demonstrated. Their confidence was quiet but firm, grounded in data rather than rhetoric. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom felt compressed, as if decades of waiting had narrowed into a single corridor with no room to turn back. The attorney spoke directly to the jury now, synthesizing months of preparation into narratives designed to endure deliberation. They did not introduce new facts. They arranged existing ones, shaping meaning through emphasis and omission. The defense closed with a warning, urging jurors to consider the consequences of conviction based on evidence so old, to imagine themselves on trial decades from now, judged by standards that had not existed at the time. They appealed to caution, to restraint, to the principle that uncertainty must favor the accused. Their words lingered, not because they convinced, but because they unsettled. The prosecution's final words returned to the beginning, to the night that had never been allowed to end, to the evidence that had waited patiently for a voice. They spoke of responsibility, of accountability, of the idea that time does not absolve, it only delays recognition. They did not promise closure. They asked for judgment. Deliberations began in silence. Jurors retreated into a room stripped of drama, armed only with instructions and their own reasoning. Hours passed. Then days. Outside, speculation filled the void, commentators parsing expressions, predicting outcomes, filling airspace with certainty they did not possess. Inside, the work was slower, heavier, marked by careful review and difficult conversation. When the verdict finally came, it arrived without fanfare, carried in the hands of a foreperson whose voice would soon carry decades of consequence. The courtroom held its breath, not because anyone expected a miracle, but because the moment demanded respect. Whatever the outcome, it would redefine the case forever. As the words were read, the past shifted, not erased, not redeemed, but transformed. The cold case, once defined by absence, now carried a conclusion, imperfect and heavy, shaped by time and tempered by doubt but no longer silent. The verdict did not restore what had been taken. It did not answer every question. It did something quieter and more difficult. It named responsibility. In the aftermath, reactions rippled outward unevenly. Some felt relief. Others felt anger. Many felt a complicated mixture of both. The case had ended in the eyes of the law, but in the lives it had touched, it continued, reshaped by resolution rather than mystery. As the courtroom emptied and the building returned to its routine rhythm, one truth lingered, undeniable and unsettling. Time had delayed justice, but it had not defeated it. The night in 1987 had finally been forced to speak, and in doing so, it left behind a new silence, heavier than the one before, filled not with questions, but with the weight of answers that had arrived far too late to feel complete. The verdict did not settle into the room all at once. It moved slowly, like dust after a door has been slammed shut, drifting, clinging, refusing to disappear. People sat frozen, as if motion itself might disturb whatever fragile balance had just been reached. The words guilty echoed briefly, then fell into a silence that felt deeper than the one that had preceded them, heavier because it carried finality rather than uncertainty. For the family, the moment arrived without triumph. There was no release, no sense of victory, only a quiet acknowledgement that something long delayed had finally taken shape. Tears came not in waves but in fragments, private and restrained, shaped by years of learning how to grieve without witnesses. The verdict did not return what had been lost. It only confirmed that the loss had not been imagined, not exaggerated, not forgotten. The defendant absorbed the decision with a stillness that bordered on resignation. His shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, a subtle concession to gravity, to consequence, to the sudden collapse of a life that had been lived largely outside suspicion. He did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The law had finished listening. As the courtroom emptied, the case spilled back into the public sphere, where reaction took on sharper edges. Headlines declared justice served, cold case closed, DNA delivers answers after decades. The language was efficient, declarative, built for consumption. It captured the outcome but not the cost. It summarized without understanding, framed resolution as an endpoint rather than a transformation. Outside, cameras waited for statements, for sound bites that could condense 36 years into something broadcastable. Family members declined. Investigators offered careful remarks, emphasizing process over emotion, restraint over celebration. They knew better than most that the conclusion of a case does not align neatly with relief, that answers can weigh as heavily as questions once did. In the days that followed, sentencing loomed, another procedural step that carried its own gravity. The prosecution outlined aggravating factors, the defense appealed to mitigation, to age, to health, to the length of time already passed. The arguments felt oddly detached from the reality they represented, numbers and statutes standing in for decades of lived consequence. When the sentence was imposed, it arrived as expected, firm, unmistakable, closing the legal arc that had been suspended for so long. The judge spoke of accountability, of harm, of the seriousness of the crime regardless of when it was committed. The words were measured, formal, bound by precedent. They did not aim to comfort. They aimed to conclude. The defendant was led away, disappearing into a system designed to absorb individuals and reduce them to identifiers, to records, to schedules. For the first time since 1987, his name would be inseparable from the crime in any official context. The anonymity that had shielded him for decades evaporated completely, replaced by permanence of a different kind. For the community, the aftermath unfolded unevenly. Some residents felt a cautious sense of relief, believing that the long shadow cast over their street had finally lifted. Others felt unsettled, disturbed by how close the danger had always been, by how easily it had blended into routine. Familiarity, once a source of comfort, now carried an aftertaste of doubt. Conversations shifted subtly. People spoke more openly about instinct, about moments of discomfort dismissed too quickly, about the quiet signals that are often ignored because acknowledging them feels impolite, inconvenient, disruptive. The case became a reference point, a reminder that safety is not guaranteed by appearance, that normalcy can be curated, performed, maintained. Within law enforcement, the case entered a different phase of existence, transitioning from active investigation to institutional memory. It was discussed in briefings, in training sessions, in quiet conversations between detectives who understood its implications. Not as a triumph but as a lesson. Preserve everything. Question assumptions. Understand that time is unpredictable, that patience can be both liability and ally. The evidence, now central to a conviction, was recontextualized as proof of progress, of how science had caught up with truth. But it also served as a reminder of fragility, of how close the case had come to being lost entirely, how easily a misstep in preservation could have erased the possibility of resolution. The margin had been thinner than anyone liked to admit. Public fascination lingered, then slowly began to fade. Attention pulled toward newer stories, fresher outrage. Documentaries were proposed. Podcasts outlined timelines. Each retelling simplified the narrative, smoothing edges, emphasizing twists, framing the outcome as inevitable. Those closest to the case watched these interpretations with mixed feelings, grateful for acknowledgement, wary of distortion. For the family, life after the verdict required recalibration. The case had been a constant presence for so long that its resolution created an unexpected void. Advocacy, waiting, hoping had become part of their identity. Without the question of who, there remained the harder question of how to move forward with an answer that arrived too late to change what mattered most. They visited places they had avoided. They spoke names aloud without fear of reopening wounds that never truly closed. Grief shifted shape, no longer suspended in uncertainty, now grounded in reality. It was not lighter. It was different, more stable, more honest. The house remained. It always had. Its role in the story changed subtly, no longer the focal point of speculation, but still a landmark heavy with association. New occupants lived within its walls, making memories unrelated to the crime, unaware at first, then informed, then left to decide how much of that history to carry with them. Places like people adapt. Occasionally, former neighbors returned to walk the street, drawn by a need to see it with new eyes, to reconcile memory with present reality. They noted changes, renovations, trees grown taller, sidewalks cracked and repaired. Time had done what it always does, layering continuity over disruption, making the extraordinary harder to locate without guidance. The case also sparked broader conversations beyond the community, about the ethics of delayed prosecution, about the psychological impact on defendants and families alike, about the responsibility of systems to revisit what was once deemed unsolvable. Opinions varied. Some celebrated the verdict as proof that no crime truly escapes accountability. Others worried about precedent, about reliability, about the limits of evidence stretched across decades. These debates unfolded in op-eds and forums, thoughtful and detached, rarely touching the emotional core of the story. They spoke in generalities and hypotheticals because distance makes analysis easier. For those who lived the case, the arguments felt abstract, missing the texture of waiting, of not knowing, of carrying a question through most of a lifetime. As months passed, the legal chapter closed fully. Appeals were filed as expected, but the foundation remained intact. The verdict stood. The sentence stood. The case was no longer open in any functional sense. Its status shifted from unresolved to resolved, from question to record. Yet resolution did not erase presence. The case lingered in small ways, in habits altered long ago that never quite returned to baseline, in the way people looked at one another, at their surroundings, with an extra layer of attention. The community had been changed not just by the crime, but by the weight, by the prolonged uncertainty that had shaped decades of quiet vigilance. In reflective moments, investigators admitted that the case had changed them as well. It had taught humility. It had reminded them that certainty is rare, that answers often arrive without warning, that patience is not passive but active, requiring discipline and faith in process rather than outcome. The case had outlasted their expectations and rewarded their restraint. As the story settled into its final form, stripped of urgency, stripped of speculation, one truth remained clear. The cold case had not simply been solved. It had been transformed, from an absence into an acknowledgement, from silence into record. The cost of that transformation was immense, measured not in years alone but in lives shaped by waiting. And as the sun continued to rise and set over a street that had once been frozen in time, the community learned to live with an answer that did not restore balance, did not undo harm, but did something quieter and more enduring. It affirmed that even after decades, truth can still surface, not to heal completely, but to stand unavoidably in the light. Time resumed its forward motion after the sentencing, but it did so unevenly, as if unsure how to behave now that the long pause had finally ended. For years the case had existed in a state of suspension, neither active nor resolved, a question mark hovering over everything it touched. Now that question had been replaced by a statement firm and irreversible, and people had to learn how to live with the difference. In the weeks that followed, the courtroom faded from view, its benches emptied, its doors closed on a chapter that had consumed countless hours and immeasurable emotional energy. The focus shifted away from proceedings and toward consequences, subtle at first, then increasingly apparent. The verdict had not restored normalcy. It had redefined it. For the family, the days after sentencing were strangely quiet. Phone calls slowed. Messages of support tapered off. The world, having absorbed the resolution, moved on with a speed that felt almost cruel. They found themselves alone with an answer they had waited decades to receive, discovering that knowing was not the same as understanding, and that closure, as it is often imagined, is a myth that collapses under scrutiny. They sorted through old belongings, photographs that had been preserved carefully, artifacts of a life interrupted and then frozen in memory. These items no longer felt like evidence or reminders of injustice. They were simply what they had always been, traces of someone who should have grown older alongside them. The verdict had not changed that truth. It had only clarified the context in which it existed. In the community, reactions diverged. Some residents spoke openly about relief, about finally feeling that the street could exhale. Others admitted to a lingering discomfort, an awareness that resolution did not undo proximity, that the crime had occurred not because of extraordinary circumstances, but because of ordinary ones. The idea that something so devastating could unfold quietly, without warning, remained unsettling. People revisited moments they had long dismissed, interactions that now felt weighted with implication, a conversation held too casually, a presence accepted without question. These reflections were not accusations. They were exercises in understanding how easily trust is extended, how rarely it is interrogated. The case had not taught them to fear. It had taught them to notice. Local law enforcement entered a period of evaluation, not because of criticism, but because the case demanded it. Supervisors reviewed procedures, evidence storage protocols, cold case review schedules. They asked difficult questions about how many other files sat dormant, waiting for advances that had not yet arrived. The solved case became a catalyst, prompting renewed attention to unresolved ones, a reminder that time alone does not determine viability. Detectives who had worked the final phase of the investigation spoke cautiously about the experience, aware that success can invite unrealistic expectations. They emphasized that not every cold case would benefit from DNA, that patience does not guarantee answers, that science is a tool, not a promise. Still, they acknowledged the quiet shift in mindset the case had created. Hope, once rationed carefully, now felt slightly more accessible. The evidence itself, once boxed and forgotten, had become central, a testament to the importance of preservation, even when purpose is unclear. It was discussed in training sessions, cited in internal memos, referenced as an example of how restraint and diligence can matter decades later. The lesson was simple but demanding. Treat every case as if the future is watching. Public discourse continued in cycles, flaring briefly with documentaries, articles, podcasts that revisited the story with the benefit of hindsight. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: the science, the weight, the shock of arrest. Some focused on the mechanics. Others leaned into emotion. None fully captured the lived reality of carrying an unresolved question for most of a lifetime. Those closest to the case consumed this coverage selectively, aware that distance changes perspective, that narrative requires compression, that nuance is often sacrificed for clarity. They corrected errors when they felt it mattered. They let others pass. The story, once intensely personal, now belonged partly to the public, and that ownership came with distortions they could not control. The defendant's life narrowed to routines governed by institutions, days measured not by choice but by schedule. Appeals were filed as expected, language formal and procedural, focusing on technicalities rather than facts. The legal system continued its work, deliberate and slow, offering no drama, only process. For most observers, this phase faded into abstraction. The outcome felt settled, regardless of what paperwork remained. For the street where it all began, the physical environment continued to change in small, ordinary ways. Lawns were replanted, roofs replaced, cars changed, children grew. The crime receded into memory, but it did not disappear. It remained embedded, referenced obliquely, acknowledged without ceremony. New residents learned about it eventually, through quiet conversations rather than headlines. They reacted with disbelief, as people always do when confronted with the past of a place they experience as safe. How could something like that happen here? The answer, though rarely stated outright, was implicit in the case itself. It happened because here is everywhere. Because familiarity breeds assumption. Because danger does not always announce itself. The house at the center of the case continued to stand, unremarkable in appearance, resistant to symbolism. Those who passed it felt its presence differently now, not as a question, but as a marker, a reminder that answers when they come do not rewrite history. They coexist with it, layered over what remains unchanged. As the months turned into years, the emotional charge softened but did not dissipate. The case settled into something more reflective, less urgent but no less instructive. It became a reference point in conversations about justice, about time, about the limits of certainty. People spoke of it not with shock, but with gravity, acknowledging its complexity rather than reducing it to a headline. For the family, anniversaries took on new meaning. Some marked the date of disappearance. Others marked the date of arrest. The difference mattered. One represented loss. The other represented recognition. Neither offered peace in any conventional sense, but together they framed the story honestly, without false resolution. In moments of quiet, individuals involved in the case reflected on the improbability of its outcome. That evidence had survived. That technology had advanced in the right direction. That someone had decided to reopen the file at the right moment. So much had depended on chance, on decisions made without foresight, on patience exercised without guarantee. The convergence felt fragile, almost accidental. This awareness tempered celebration. It reinforced humility. The case was solved not because the system was perfect, but because it was persistent enough to allow improvement to catch up. That distinction mattered. It shaped how people spoke about justice, less as a destination and more as a process subject to delay, error, and correction. As public attention continued to drift, the case's influence remained strongest where it was least visible, in the habits people had formed unconsciously, in the extra moment of consideration before dismissing a concern, in the willingness to question what seems obvious. These changes did not announce themselves. They accumulated quietly, reshaping behavior without spectacle. The cold case had closed officially, but its legacy unfolded slowly, unevenly, resisting simple interpretation. It was not a story of triumph or failure, but of endurance, of how truth can be postponed without being erased, of how answers, when they arrive late, still demand to be carried. And as the years extended beyond the verdict, the community learned that resolution is not an ending but a transformation, one that replaces uncertainty with responsibility, silence with acknowledgement. The night in 1987 no longer asked who or how. It asked something harder, something more enduring. What do we do with the truth once time finally releases it? Years after the verdict, the case continued to surface in unexpected places, not as breaking news, but as a reference point, a quiet benchmark against which other unresolved crimes were measured. Detectives mentioned it in passing during briefings, journalists cited it when discussing advances in forensic science, Families of other victims whispered its name with cautious hope. It had become a symbol, not of certainty but of possibility, and that distinction carried weight. Within the department, the file was no longer active, yet it was never fully put away. It lived in training rooms and policy discussions, its pages turned by new hands, younger investigators studying the decisions that had once seemed ordinary but proved consequential decades later. They examined the chain of custody, the notes written in margins, the moments where assumptions had narrowed focus too quickly. The case taught without lecturing, offering its lessons through survival rather than success. Veteran officers, those who had been present in the late 80s, remembered the original investigation differently now. What once felt thorough now appeared limited by the tools and culture of the time. They spoke candidly about blind spots, about how confidence can harden into certainty, about how the pressure to resolve a case can quietly discourage patience. The solved cold case did not absolve the past. It illuminated it. Outside law enforcement, the community's relationship with the case evolved in subtle ways. Initial shock gave way to reflection to normalization. The story became part of local history, taught informally through anecdotes rather than articles. People referenced it the way they referenced storms or fires, events that marked time, dividing life into before and after. It was no longer sensational. It was foundational. New families moved into the neighborhood unaware at first of its history. When they learned, it was rarely through headlines, but through neighbors who spoke carefully, measuring tone and detail. The crime was described without embellishment, the resolution without celebration. The message was consistent. This happened, it took a long time to understand, and it changed us. What listeners did with that information varied. Some felt unease, imagining echoes where there were none. Others felt reassured, believing that resolution, however delayed, meant safety had been restored. Both reactions missed something essential. The case had never been about restoring comfort. It had been about confronting reality, about acknowledging that harm can exist alongside routine, that answers do not guarantee protection. The family remained largely private, their public role diminishing as the story receded from headlines. They declined invitations to participate in media projects, choosing instead to preserve what remained of their privacy. Their advocacy shifted focus, away from their own case and toward broader support for families navigating unresolved loss. They understood the landscape intimately, its emotional terrain mapped through experience rather than theory. They spoke about waiting, about the particular exhaustion that comes from not knowing, from carrying questions that outlast seasons and milestones. They did not promise closure. They did not suggest that answers heal. They spoke honestly, offering companionship rather than solutions. For many, that honesty mattered more than optimism. The defendants' appeals continued quietly, moving through procedural channels with little public attention. Legal arguments focused on admissibility, on interpretation, on whether time itself constituted prejudice. The courts responded methodically, acknowledging complexity without wavering from the core findings. Each ruling reaffirmed the verdict, reinforcing the sense that the case, whatever its emotional aftershocks, was legally settled. Yet the philosophical questions lingered. People debated the ethics of delayed justice, of holding individuals accountable decades after a crime, of the balance between memory and fairness. These discussions unfolded in classrooms and columns, thoughtful and abstract. They rarely intersected with the lived experience of those most affected, whose relationship with time had never been theoretical. For them, delay was not an argument. It was a condition. It shaped birthdays and holidays, decisions and doubts. It taught endurance without offering explanation. The eventual answer did not erase that conditioning. It merely reframed it, turning an open-ended wait into a defined past. The physical artifacts of the case continued to exist, preserved in archives and evidence rooms, labeled and catalogued, their significance now fixed rather than potential. Items once treated with cautious hope were now treated with historical care. They were no longer tools. They were proof. That shift carried its own gravity. Occasionally, a new technological development sparked speculation about whether other evidence might yield additional insights. Experts were consulted, probabilities discussed. Each time the conclusion was the same. The core truth had been established. Further inquiry might add detail, but it would not alter the foundation. The case had reached its limit, not because curiosity was exhausted, but because resolution had been achieved. Still, the human mind resists finality. People continue to ask questions, to imagine alternate scenarios, to wonder about moments that could never be fully reconstructed. These impulses were not attempts to undermine the verdict. They were expressions of discomfort with certainty, reminders that understanding does not always align neatly with acceptance. In quiet conversations, community members admitted that part of them missed the ambiguity, not because they preferred ignorance, but because uncertainty had allowed for distance. Answers demanded engagement. They forced acknowledgement of proximity, of shared space, of the unsettling fact that the extraordinary had occurred within the ordinary. This awareness influenced behavior in small, nearly invisible ways. People checked in on neighbors more often. They paid attention to changes in routine. They questioned assumptions without dramatizing them. The case had recalibrated vigilance, not toward fear but toward awareness. For younger generations, those who had not lived through the original event, the case was history rather than memory. They learned about it secondhand, absorbing its lessons without its emotional immediacy. Teachers referenced it when discussing forensic science. Parents mentioned it when talking about trust. Its impact persisted, even as its emotional charge diffused. The media, having exhausted the immediate narrative, occasionally revisited the case on anniversaries, framing it as a milestone, a reminder of how far technology had come. These pieces were polished, efficient, and incomplete. They focused on resolution, not on the years in between. They highlighted outcome over endurance. Those who noticed this imbalance rarely objected publicly. They understood the constraints of storytelling, the need for clarity, for arcs that resolve. They also understood what was lost in that translation. The long middle where life continued without answers, where hope and resignation coexisted uneasily. As time passed, the case's influence extended beyond its original context, shaping conversations about cold cases nationally. It was cited alongside others, part of a growing body of examples suggesting that patience, preservation, and progress could intersect meaningfully. This narrative inspired, but it also risked oversimplification, implying inevitability where none existed. Those closest to the story resisted that implication. They knew how easily the outcome could have been different, how many variables had aligned by chance rather than design. They emphasized contingency over destiny, cautioning against assuming that time alone delivers justice. In reflective moments, investigators acknowledged that the case had altered their relationship with uncertainty. They had learned to coexist with unanswered questions without surrendering to them, to hold space for possibility without allowing it to distort judgment. This balance, they agreed, was among the most difficult skills to cultivate. The street itself remained unchanged in ways that mattered. It was still quiet, still lined with familiar structures, still subject to the same rhythms of daily life. The difference lay not in appearance but in perception. It had become a place where people understood that history does not announce itself, that significance can hide in plain sight. As the case settled further into the past, its presence became less intrusive but no less instructive. It no longer demanded attention. It invited contemplation. It asked not what had happened, but how it had been possible, and what responsibility that knowledge carried forward. The cold case, once defined by absence, now existed as a complete narrative, its beginning and end established, its middle marked by endurance. It remained imperfect, heavy, resistant to simplification. And in that resistance lay its most enduring impact, a reminder that truth, when delayed, does not arrive gently, but it arrives with the power to reshape how a community understands itself, long after the headlines have faded. The longer the case remained resolved, the more its presence changed shape, no longer loud or confrontational, but persistent, woven into the background of daily life like a low-frequency hum you only notice when it stops. People thought they had moved on. Then a sound, a date, a fragment of news would pull them back, reminding them that resolution does not erase imprint. In the years that followed, the street became a point of reference rather than a destination. Journalists stopped coming. True crime tourists never really arrived. What remained was subtler. A shared understanding among those who lived there that something irreversible had happened, and that knowing the truth did not restore innocence. It simply replaced one form of unease with another. Trust, once fractured, did not rebuild itself automatically. It returned unevenly, selectively, shaped by experience rather than optimism. Neighbors were cordial, polite, functional, but a thin membrane of caution lingered beneath routine interactions. People locked doors they once left open. They paid closer attention to unfamiliar cars. These habits felt practical, not paranoid, learned responses rather than reactions. The case also altered how the community understood time. Decades had passed between crime and arrest, a span long enough to encompass entire lives. Children born after the night in 1987 had grown into adults before the truth emerged. The delay reframed the concept of justice, stretching it beyond immediacy, forcing people to accept that accountability can arrive long after its moment has passed. For some, that realization was comforting. For others, it was deeply unsettling. The idea that consequences could be postponed for so long raised questions about how many other answers remained buried, waiting for conditions to align. The solved cold case became a symbol not just of possibility, but of uncertainty, a reminder of how much remains unseen. Within law enforcement, the case continued to influence priorities. Cold case units received renewed attention. Modest funding increases justified by the proof that persistence could yield results. But expectations were tempered. Supervisors were careful to emphasize that success was not guaranteed, that reopening cases carried emotional and ethical weight, especially for families who had learned to live with ambiguity. Investigators spoke privately about the burden of reopening wounds, about the responsibility that comes with reintroducing hope. The solved case had ended one long wait, but it had also highlighted the danger of false anticipation. Each decision to revisit an old file now came with the memory of how long and heavy that wait could become. For the family, life continued to unfold in small, deliberate steps. They navigated a world that no longer asked questions about the case, no longer required explanations or updates. The absence of inquiry was both relief and loss. For years, the story had demanded attention. Now it existed quietly, contained within them. They found ways to honor memory without anchoring themselves to the crime. Birthdays were acknowledged. Traditions adapted. Stories were shared that had nothing to do with evidence or suspects. The person at the center of the case slowly reclaimed an identity separate from tragedy, remembered for laughter, for habits, for moments that had nothing to do with how their life ended. Yet even in these moments, the awareness of time lingered. There were always calculations, silent and unavoidable, measuring what should have been against what was. The verdict had answered who, but it could never answer what might have been. That question lived on, resistant to closure, untouched by law or science. Public interest resurfaced occasionally, triggered by anniversaries or new technological breakthroughs. Each resurgence brought a wave of commentary, speculation about how many other cases might now be solvable. The solved cold case was cited as proof, as inspiration, as justification. Rarely was the human cost of waiting emphasized. Those closest to the case understood that cost intimately. They had lived it in the spaces between updates, in the long stretches of silence punctuated by disappointment. They knew that every cold case represented not just a puzzle, but a collection of lives paused, reshaped, redirected by uncertainty. The defendant remained largely invisible, reduced to references in legal documents and institutional records. His absence from public consciousness was complete. There were no interviews, no statements, no attempts to explain or justify. The silence around him was total, and in that silence speculation faded, replaced by a blunt acceptance of fact. Psychologists continue to analyze the phenomenon of delayed accountability, offering frameworks for understanding how individuals can compartmentalize actions across decades. These explanations circulated academically, occasionally surfacing in media coverage. They provided insight but not absolution. The distance between explanation and forgiveness remained vast. As the case settled further into history, its narrative began to stabilize. Disputed details fell away. Speculation lost urgency. What remained was a clear if incomplete account. A crime committed, a mystery endured, an answer delivered late. The simplicity of that outline belied the complexity beneath it, but it was enough to anchor memory. In schools and community groups, the case was sometimes mentioned in broader discussions about safety, about awareness, about the importance of paying attention to what feels off. It was framed carefully, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of vigilance. The message was understated, stripped of sensationalism, grounded in lived experience. The physical artifacts of the case gradually disappeared from everyday view. Old newspaper clippings yellowed and were discarded. News footage was archived. What remained were digital traces, searchable and persistent, ready to resurface at any moment. The permanence of online record contrasted sharply with the fragility of memory, ensuring that the case could never fully fade. For those who searched it deliberately, the story remained accessible, frozen in language that emphasized shock and resolution. But for those who had lived it, the digital version felt incomplete, lacking the texture of waiting, the weight of years without answers. The difference between record and experience was stark. Occasionally, someone would ask whether the resolution had brought peace. The question was well-intentioned but flawed. Peace implied an ending, a state achieved and maintained. What the case had brought was acknowledgement, recognition, a confirmation that the loss had mattered enough to be pursued, even belatedly. That acknowledgement carried its own gravity. It validated decades of endurance, of refusal to let the story be forgotten. It did not undo harm, but it affirmed persistence. In that affirmation, some found a measure of stability, if not peace. As time continued its steady advance, the solved cold case became less about its conclusion and more about its implications. It stood as evidence that time can obscure but not necessarily erase truth, that patience and preservation can intersect with progress in unexpected ways. Yet it also stood as a caution, a reminder that waiting has consequences, that answers delayed can never fully compensate for years lived in uncertainty. The balance between hope and realism remained delicate, shaped by the memory of how long it had taken for this particular truth to emerge. In quiet moments, when the noise of coverage and commentary fell away, the case revealed its most enduring lesson. Not that justice always arrives. Not that science will inevitably solve what time conceals. But that stories left unresolved continue to exert pressure, shaping lives and communities long after the moment of violence has passed. The night in 1987 no longer demanded explanation. Its facts were established, but its impact continued to unfold, rippling outward through time, touching lives in ways both visible and subtle. Resolution had not ended the story. It had simply changed how it was carried. And so the case remained present, not as a headline or a mystery, but as a quiet, persistent truth, integrated into the fabric of a community that had learned, slowly and irrevocably, that some answers arrive too late to heal, but never too late to matter. With enough distance from the verdict, the case began to occupy a strange middle ground between history and memory, no longer raw, no longer urgent, but never fully settled. It surfaced in unexpected ways, woven into conversations about unrelated things, triggered by nothing more than a passing reference to the late 80s, a documentary trailer, a mention of DNA on the evening news. The past did not announce itself. It intruded quietly. For many in the community, the solved cold case reshaped how they understood safety. Not in dramatic gestures, not through fear-driven behavior, but through subtle recalibrations. They trusted but less automatically. They listened but more critically. They learned that danger does not always come from the margins, that familiarity is not evidence of harmlessness, that longevity does not equal innocence. These realizations did not make life smaller. They made it sharper. People paid attention to details they once dismissed. Patterns mattered more. Silence was no longer neutral. The case had taught them that absence of noise does not mean absence of threat, and that what goes unspoken can be as significant as what is shouted. In professional circles, particularly among investigators and forensic specialists, the case continued to circulate as an example of delayed convergence. Technology, preservation, and timing had finally aligned, but only barely. It prompted difficult internal discussions about how many other cases depended on similar alignment, how many answers were still contingent on breakthroughs that did not yet exist. There was an uncomfortable acknowledgement that luck had played a role. Not luck in the crime itself, but in the survival of evidence, in the decisions made by individuals long gone from their positions. The system had not been designed with the future in mind. It had simply been flexible enough to allow the future to intervene. That realization complicated the narrative of progress. It suggested that advancement alone is insufficient without humility, without an understanding of how fragile opportunity can be. The solved case was not proof of inevitability, it was proof of contingency. For the family, the passage of time after resolution continued to alter their relationship with the story. The urgency that had once defined their days had dissolved, replaced by something quieter but no less demanding. They were no longer advocates chasing answers. They were custodians of memory, responsible for deciding how the story would be carried forward. They encountered new challenges in this role. Younger relatives asked questions framed without the weight of uncertainty, curious rather than desperate. Explaining the case without reliving it required careful language, a balance between honesty and protection. The family learned that resolution does not end storytelling. It changes its audience. In these conversations, the absence of speculation felt significant. For decades, the story had been full of maybes and what-ifs. Now it was anchored by fact. The clarity was stabilizing, but it also removed the illusion that something might still be undone. The finality demanded acceptance rather than anticipation. The broader public engaged with the case intermittently, often as part of larger discussions about cold cases, forensic science, or criminal psychology. It was cited as an example, a data point, a narrative device. Rarely did these references acknowledge the decades of emotional labor endured by those most affected. This abstraction was not malicious. It was a function of distance. Without lived experience, the case became a concept rather than a continuum. Its weight was measurable only in years, not in nights spent waiting for calls that never came, in holidays marked by absence, in plans permanently altered. Occasionally, journalists sought follow-up interviews, looking for reflections, for insights gained after time had softened the edges. Responses were cautious. The family understood the value of perspective, but they also understood the risk of reduction, of having complexity flattened into quotable lines. They spoke when it felt purposeful. They declined when it did not. The defendant's presence in the narrative continued to recede, becoming almost incidental. He existed as a fact rather than a figure, defined by actions rather than personality. This erasure was intentional. The story no longer centered on him. It centered on impact. In academic settings, the case appeared in lectures and papers examining delayed justice. It was dissected methodically, timelines mapped, decisions evaluated. These analyses were rigorous, necessary, and detached. They focused on process rather than pain, on systems rather than individuals. Both perspectives were valid, but they rarely intersected. That separation mirrored a broader truth about how society processes crime. There is the story as lived, and the story as studied. The cold case occupied both spaces, but fully belonged to neither. Its meaning shifted depending on who was looking, and from how far away. As technology continued to evolve, the case was occasionally revisited in speculative terms. What if this had been available sooner? What if evidence had degraded? What if one decision had gone differently? These hypotheticals were intellectually engaging but emotionally hollow. They did not change what had happened. They only underscored how precarious the outcome had been. For those who remembered the early years before headlines, before trials, before closure, these discussions felt almost surreal. They remembered a time when the case was just a question, when the idea of resolution seemed distant, even naive. The contrast between then and now was stark and sometimes difficult to reconcile. The physical spaces associated with the case continued to exist in parallel realities. To most, they were ordinary locations, unremarkable and functional. To a few, they carried layers of meaning invisible to outsiders. Passing through them required no ceremony, but it did require awareness. This duality extended to time itself. Calendar years moved forward predictably, but emotional time behaved differently, looping, pausing, resurfacing without warning. The solved cold case had not synchronized these timelines. It had simply clarified where they diverged. In moments of reflection, some community members acknowledged that the case had altered their understanding of justice in a fundamental way. They no longer expected neat resolutions or timely answers. They understood that justice can be partial, delayed, imperfect, and still meaningful. This acceptance did not diminish their standards, deepen them. The case also challenged the idea of closure as a universal endpoint. It demonstrated that endings are often administrative rather than emotional. that paperwork can conclude while memory persists. Closure, when it arrived, was unevenly distributed, experienced differently by each person touched by the story. As years accumulated, the case became less about what had been discovered and more about what had been endured. The emphasis shifted from solution to survival, from revelation to resilience. This reframing did not erase the importance of the verdict, it contextualized it. The solved cold case stood as a reminder that answers, when they come late, do not erase the past. They reshape it. They change how stories are told, how responsibility is assigned, how memory is organized. They demand integration rather than celebration. And in that integration, the case found its lasting place. Not as a spectacle, not as a cautionary tale alone, but as a testament to the long, uneven path between harm and acknowledgement. A path measured not just in years but in endurance. The night in 1987 had been given a name, a narrative, a conclusion, but its resonance extended far beyond that moment, continuing to influence how people thought about time, truth, and the quiet persistence of unanswered questions that, once resolved, leave behind answers heavy enough to last a lifetime. As the case drifted further from the present, it began to lose its sharp edges in public memory, smoothing into something more symbolic than immediate. What once felt urgent now felt reflective, as if the story itself had slowed its breathing, settling into a long exhale that stretched across generations. The solved cold case no longer demanded attention. It waited quietly to be remembered. In the community, newer stories took precedence. Different crimes, different fears, different headlines. Yet beneath these shifting narratives, the old case remained a reference point, an unspoken benchmark against which other events were measured. When a new investigation stalled, someone would inevitably mention it. When hope felt thin, someone would recall how long answers had once taken to arrive. This comparison carried both comfort and caution. Comfort because it suggested that time does not automatically erase truth. Caution because it reminded everyone how fragile that truth can be, how dependent it is on preservation, on chance, on people who choose not to give up even when momentum is gone. For those who had lived through the earliest years of uncertainty, memory worked differently. They remembered not the headlines but the waiting, the phone calls that never came, the rumors that surfaced and dissolved, the sense that life was moving forward without permission, carrying them along while something essential remained unresolved. That sensation never fully disappeared. It simply became familiar. The verdict, now years old, had changed the shape of that memory but not its depth. It provided a frame, a context, a way to organize what had once been chaotic. But it did not replace the experience of living without answers. That experience remained embedded, informing how those individuals approached uncertainty in other areas of life. Some spoke openly about becoming more patient, more tolerant of ambiguity. Others admitted the opposite, describing a heightened discomfort with unanswered questions, a need for clarity that bordered on urgency. The case had not shaped everyone the same way. Its influence was personal, unpredictable, as individual as grief itself. Within the justice system, the case continued to influence policy discussions, often quietly, without attribution. Evidence retention standards were revisited. Cold case review schedules were adjusted. None of these changes were dramatic. They were incremental, procedural, easy to overlook. But they mattered precisely because they were built to endure rather than impress. Veteran investigators sometimes used the case as a private benchmark, a reminder of why patience mattered, why documentation mattered, why ego could not be allowed to outrun evidence. They spoke about it less frequently as time passed, but when they did, it was with a tone that signaled respect rather than pride. For younger officers, the case existed as a story they inherited rather than experienced. They learned about it through briefings, articles, secondhand accounts. Its emotional weight was diluted by distance, but its lessons remained intact. It served as proof that outcomes are not always aligned with effort, that good work can take years to reveal its value. Outside institutional settings, the case lived on through quieter channels, family conversations, private reflections, the occasional moment when someone caught themselves imagining an alternate timeline, one in which the truth had surfaced sooner, in which lives had unfolded differently. These imaginings were fleeting but persistent, surfacing without invitation. The family learned to navigate these moments with care. They allowed themselves to wonder, but not for long, dwelling too deeply on what might have been threatened to unravel the stability they had built since resolution. Acceptance, they discovered, was not a single decision but a practice repeated daily, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. As years passed, the language used to describe the case softened. Words like shock and twist gave way to terms like legacy and impact. The emphasis shifted from the mechanics of the investigation to the human endurance it had required. This shift did not diminish the significance of the solution. It deepened it, situating it within a broader narrative about time and resilience. Occasionally, the case resurfaced in public forums, referenced in discussions about cold cases nationally. It was held up as an example of what persistence could achieve, often without acknowledging the emotional toll such persistence exacts. Those who understood that toll listened quietly, aware that the story was being used to inspire rather than to explain. In these moments, there was a temptation to correct the narrative, to insist on nuance, to remind others that waiting decades for answers is not a victory condition. But most resisted that impulse. They understood that stories evolved to meet the needs of those telling them, and that no retelling could fully capture the complexity of living through uncertainty. The physical remnants of the case continued to fade. Buildings were renovated. Landscapes changed. Even the climate felt different, seasons less predictable than they once were. Time asserted itself everywhere, indifferent to significance. The case did not stop this progression. It existed within it, subject to the same erosion as everything else. Yet certain details remained stubbornly vivid for those who remembered. A particular streetlight, a sound carried through open windows, the way the air felt on a specific night in 1987. These sensory fragments resisted fading, anchored by emotion rather than fact. They were not evidence. They were memory. The solved cold case had given these memories a place to rest, a narrative that allowed them to coexist without constant tension. They no longer demanded explanation. They simply existed, acknowledged and integrated. This integration did not bring peace in any dramatic sense. It brought stability, a quieter form of endurance. As the community continued to evolve, the case became part of its collective identity, not as a defining feature, but as a reference, a shared experience that had shaped attitudes and assumptions. It influenced how people talked about safety, about vigilance, about the long arc of accountability. The idea that truth can surface after decades altered expectations. People no longer assumed that silence meant resolution. They understood that absence of news did not equal absence of progress. This understanding fostered a cautious optimism, one grounded not in certainty, but in possibility. At the same time, there was an awareness that not every story would follow the same path. The solved cold case did not guarantee outcomes for others. It simply demonstrated that time is not always the final arbiter. That knowledge was both empowering and sobering. In private moments, some acknowledged that the case had changed how they understood endings. They no longer expected clean conclusions or emotional symmetry. They accepted that some answers arrive stripped of comfort, that resolution can coexist with loss, that acknowledgement does not undo harm. This acceptance did not erase grief. It reshaped it, allowing it to occupy a defined space rather than spilling endlessly into the present. The verdict had drawn a line, not between past and future, but between uncertainty and fact. That distinction mattered. As the years continued to accumulate, the solved cold case remained what it had become over time. Less a story about a crime and more a meditation on patience, on the limits of justice, on the enduring weight of unanswered questions even after they are answered. The night in 1987 had long since receded into history. Its facts were recorded, its outcome established. Yet its influence persisted, subtle and far-reaching, reminding those who remembered that time does not heal everything, but it can sometimes reveal enough truth to change how the past is carried forward.